Hello and welcome to China Now. My name is Makiza Latifa. This week we begin with the Thinkers Forum, where we take a deeper look at the forces shaping global politics and international relations. In this edition of the show, Professor Shani of Fudan University examines one of the most sensitive and consequential issues in the US-China relations, Taiwan. In a discussion titled US-China Summit, Is Taiwan on the Bargaining Table? Professor Shan argues that while Beijing would never treat Taiwan as something to be negotiated away, the issue remains the most dangerous flashpoints between China and the United States. He also suggests that Washington will eventually need to clarify its position, whether it supports Taiwan independence, opposes it, or is prepared to support peaceful reunification. Professor Shani is a professor of international politics at Fudan University and one of China's most prominent online commentators with a large following across Chinese social media platforms. So stay with us for all the details.
I think we all understand that that is the optimal case coming out of Trump's mouth. But I think a lot of people are saying that for China, it will never allow the Taiwan issue to be explicitly something on the bargaining table, meaning that is something that is purely domestic for the Chinese and it will be never offered up as something to be traded with. Do you agree with that view?
Of course, it's a domestic issues, but we have three joint communiques between China and the United States. And the third joint communique is purely on U.S. arms sales to Taiwan. Let's say that U.S. will not sell the permanent arms sales to Taiwan and promise the total amount or the quantity of the arms sales to Taiwan will be not higher than those. So that you will say that you will find out during this summit in several times, China say in these Taiwan issues, he said that we wish United States will keep its promise. What promise? Of course, the promise you make in the joint communique. You say that you will not continuing same arms sale to Taiwan, but you break out your promise.
So China will hold the US to its own words.
The second, it's the first time China said very clearly, and the sentence is a moment. I will find out the sentence. It say that the peace of the Taiwan Strait is kind of 维护台海和平稳定是中美双方最大公约数。Ensure the security and the stability of Taiwan Strait is the common or the shared strategic requirements from both sides. We don't say that the Taiwan issues you have the right to launch interventions, but we say that the Taiwan Strait, the peace and the stability of the Taiwan Strait is our shared strategic requirements. Don't be that naive that China is so naive on these Taiwan issues. If you go back to the 1950s, in Wanlong Conference, Prime Minister Zhou Enlai he said that we will never discuss about so-called ceasefire in the Taiwan Strait. There's no fire to cease in this strait, but we'd like to dialogue with the United States on how to release the tension situations in fast regions, including Taiwan area or including Taiwan Strait. That's our diplomatic arch. We face the reality. You cannot say that because legally United States cannot intervene in China's domestic issues, so we will refuse to dialogue with United States on this Taiwan issue. Taiwan issue is very crystal clear. One of the most important part of Sino-US relationships. That's our terms. We have the bottom lines, the red lines. Of course, you cannot cross the bottom lines, cross the red lines. But also on the other side, it means the Taiwan issue just a timing bombers or it's the untiming bombers that threaten the strategic stabilities of these bilateral relationships. We of course want to debomb it. How to debomb it? We need to dialogue with the United States and try to find a way how the United States can send in a very clear signals. So the thing is very interesting. The point is United States has different options. It has option spectrums on these Taiwan issues. They can choose to support the so-called Taiwan independence. If they choose it means war. They can say, I don't support it. They can say, opposing it. And United States can say, I support peaceful reunifications. And of course, say that I support United States support reunifications. That at least you have 5 options. For US, you need to find out what's your major interest on these Taiwan issues. If the major interest is you don't want to risk a direct military confrontations on China in the Taiwan Strait, the best choice is you say that you will opposing Taiwan independence and support peaceful reunification. Because it's not my logic. It's US scholar logic. Since Biden administrations, there's articles in Washington Post and Foreign Affairs and even in a RAND report, they always share the same framework. First, the fact is you don't have enough military strength on Taiwan Strait to launch your coercive policies to mainland China. Second, you cannot share the burden that you have been publicly militarily defeat in Taiwan Strait. That will means your hegemonic collapsing. Third, your interest. What's your real interest on these Taiwan issues? If you're talking about the semi-productions, you already coerced this TSMC to remove their production capacities to US mainland. Such kind of moving of technical capacities can very concretely avoid or decrease the risk, the so-called potential risk after this reunification. And the second, the so-called geopolitical advantages of this Taiwan Strait. Come on, friends, that means you want to some imaginations you can cover up the People's Republic of China's naval forces in this mainland by the so-called island chain. But the fact is, the naval forces already beyond that line. Today, it's nearly mission impossible to realize such kind of geopolitical advantages. So need to face the react. You need to face the fact. And the third point is so-called the United States want to its reputations, don't want to losing face. So the smart ways to avoid losing face is you actively support peaceful reunification, because according to US strategic blurs, they always say they agree the peaceful settlement of Taiwan issues. Then the peaceful settlement of these Taiwan issues, of course, has 3 potential options: the so-called peaceful dependence, the status quo, and the peaceful reunifications. The peaceful independence mission impossible, definitely we will use force, that leading to trigger the red lines. The status, they never really exist. The so-called status is heavily dependent on the power distributions across the strait and the power distributions among United States and China. And this power distribution has already de facto changed. And you have the last options to support, very actively support the peaceful reunifications. It will not leading to a losing face of United States. And of course, it will give you a very important gift, the friendship from this reunified China. I think that will be very important for the future development of this US-China relationship in a general ways.
And continuing with the Thinkers Forum, a journalist and geopolitical analyst, Pepe Escobar, takes a closer look at Donald Trump's visit to Beijing in a discussion titled, "What did Trump bring to Beijing?" Escobar examines the strategic calculations on both sides, exploring the leverage Washington and Beijing each bring to the table, the interests they are seeking to protect, and what the visit could mean for the future direction of US-China relations. There's more coming up shortly. Let's keep it rolling.
The most important diplomatic meeting. What does he bring to the table? How can Trump possibly think that he will change the situation just by sitting on the same table with President Xi Jinping in Beijing? The Chinese are not in a hurry. We are talking a few hours before the President of the United States arrives in Beijing for arguably the most important diplomatic meeting of this year of war 2026. What does he bring to the table to discuss in Beijing with President Xi Jinping? Not much. To be blunt, we can say that he holds 0 cards or even less than 0 cards. He wants to have a summit in Beijing that he can sell to domestic public opinion, especially as a win, a victory. That's the typical Trump language. There's not much that he can extract from President Xi Jinping to be sold as a victory, because everything that Trump 2.0 unleashed against China, there was a serious blowback. The trade war, the tech war, intimations, blocking technology to be sold to China. The war in Iran itself, which was originally conceived by people who are way above Donald Trump. Let's say a connection, a very dangerous connection of big banking in the United States, techno-feudalists, the future present and future leaders of high tech and artificial intelligence in the US, and what we could describe as a Zionist international axis. These are the people who actually control Donald Trump. And of course, the war against Iran was very important for these actors in terms of the reorganization of the geopolitical and geoeconomic space. It went terribly wrong from an American imperial point of view. And the fact that the President of the United States, after suffering a strategic defeat in the battlefield in Iran, comes up with the idea of blockading Iranian ports and the Strait of Hormuz. At the same time that the horrible effects on the American economy are getting sharper and sharper, not to mention the effects on the global economy, this has to be seen as among one of the most extraordinary debacles in the history of American foreign policy, if not the #1 debacle. So how can Trump possibly think that he will change the situation just by sitting on the same table with President Xi Jinping in Beijing? It's not going to happen. And essentially, President Xi and the Chinese leadership want to get rid of this summit as soon as possible and go back to what they have been doing, which is solidifying the strategic strengths of China. They are essentially enshrined in the new 5-year plan. And there's nothing that Trump can do to alter these basic facts. Talking about Donald Trump, you always have to look at what to many people might seem very petty details, which is essentially his political career and the favors that he owns to his donors in the American political sphere, and to people who still can be described as his constituency and his voters. The most important aspect is the midterms election next November. And the prospects for the Trump brand and for the Republicans are absolutely horrible. So he's thinking most of all in trying to sell some idea of victory after the summit in Beijing with Xi Jinping for this domestic audience. Okay, let's give 3 examples. First of all, if he convinces China to buy more American soybeans, that will more or less appease his Midwest voters in the United States. Same thing if he convinces China to buy more Boeing planes. That's going to be a very, very tough sell. China prefers to invest in their homegrown aircraft. And if he convinces China to sell rare earth with no restrictions whatsoever to the United States, also is going to be a very, very tough, hard sell, because this is absolutely essential for the way the whole industrial military complex in the United States work. Can he pressure President Xi Jinping on any of these 3 points? Maybe in only one of them, the soybeans. The other ones is going to be very, very hard. And of course, in terms of foreign policy, he's going to try to pressure President Xi Jinping to apply pressure on Iran in terms of unblocking the Strait of Hormuz, which is not blocked by the Iranians. The Strait of Hormuz has a new rules of passage, which they are entitled to because the Strait of Hormuz falls into Iranian territorial waters. What is being blocked is not only the Strait of Hormuz from the outside, but Iranian ports by the Americans and outside of the Persian Gulf. So in fact, the Americans would have to end their own blockade, which Trump already said is not going to happen. So it's even more absurd to expect that Trump will convince President Xi Jinping to apply pressure on the Iranians to unblock what is not unblocked, which is their own Strait of Hormuz. So then he can sell this as a victory inside the United States. And if there is a total unblocking of everything in Hormuz and in the Persian Gulf, this means that less stress on the American economy, less stress on augmenting inflation in the US. The Fed could cut interest rates. And even for the global economy, this would be much better. Trump simply has no cards to pressure President Xi about any of the above. In fact, it's fascinating to see that large sections of Western mainstream media actually agree that President Trump arrives in China with virtually no cards, or, to be correct, 0 cards to pressure President Xi Jinping. There are many aspects around this analysis. Many of these media, they are I would say, avidly anti-Trump. But some who want to conduct a more or less impartial analysis and looking at the effects of Trump's policies on the trade war, on the tech war, and on the war of Iran, completely illegal and condemned directly by China, in China and at the UN in New York. They see that obviously, Trump has absolutely no means of persuading Xi Jinping on any of these fronts. On the trade front, on the technological front, on the rare earth front, on evading US sanctions, and especially on the war as a whole, because Xi Jinping, the Chinese leadership, and virtually everyone around China and Southeast Asia, parts of East Asia, Central Asia, etc. They understand that this war is not only against Iran, and especially for the Americans to control oil being produced in Iran and gas, which is part of their overall large global strategy, but is also a war against China. And all these sanctions, all these pressures are always directed against China, of containing China, of, I would say, very, very brilliant, between commas, idea of, okay, we go to Iran, we control the Strait of Hormuz, and then we control the amount of energy that Iran exports to China. Reality is proving to everyone around the world that this backfired completely. And on the contrary, tankers leaving from Iran and going to China, they keep moving through the Strait of Hormuz virtually with no problems. One or two may be intercepted later. Iranian tankers may be intercepted later by the Americans, but the Americans would never dare to block a Chinese tanker leaving from an Iranian port, transporting energy to China. So once again, there are zero means of pressuring China. China does not react well to being pressured by a foreign power. And this is something that by now the Trump administration should be fully aware of. The problem is they are not. The Taiwan issue, of course, let's say, is probably the last remaining possible card for the Americans. The problem is Taiwan is considered by China correctly as an internal security matter. It's impermeable to foreign interference. So on the table, in theory, President Xi Jinping could even argue to Trump face to face, would you considering stopping or restricting this $11 billion sale of weapons to Taiwan? Everything, including Patriot missiles, F-35 planes, etc. This, it's not absolutely essential or necessary for China. It's not going to alter, essentially, the geopolitical and the military situation in Taiwan and in the South China Sea. And obviously, even if President Xi gets deeper into it, he knows that Trump will never make a concession because he will be wanting concessions in between. So from the Chinese point of view, whatever he says and whatever means of pressure, these are not essential for the continuation of the Chinese project in the 5-year plan of becoming an ultra high-tech power, where artificial intelligence will be permeated into at least 70% of the Chinese economy. There are steps to get to it, very well designed, very well organized. And of course, in terms of rare earths, all the cards are in the Chinese camp. They can be absolutely immovable unless the Trump administration would make serious concessions. And even concerning Taiwan, these are not essential. Perhaps the most important concessions will be, okay, let's end this tsunami of tariffs against China. This is something that might influence President Xi Jinping. But apart from that, everything else is peripheral to the absolutely main drive of China for the next 5 years, which is the ultra high-tech modernization of the Chinese system, Chinese society, and the way China works. US-China relations, as we all know, is one of the most complex geopolitical issues of the 21st century, arguably the most complex issues. The best possible outcome of a summit that is not going to dig deeper or solve serious structural problems in this relationship will be a continuation of the fragile status quo as we have it for the next few months until the end of the year. And after, of course, the midterm elections, where Trump will probably emerge even more weakened than he is now, he will have, if he has less than 0 cards at the time, as we speak, the cards will have completely disappear after November this year. So the Chinese are not in a hurry. And they know that the desperation to get some sort of deal or some sort of alleviation of structural problems is on the American side. And all that is compounded by something that in front of the whole planet now is becoming extremely, it's self-evident, in fact. The strategic defeat, practically total strategic defeat of the United States in West Asia in a war against Iran that they launched unilaterally without thinking about the consequences. And now that they are desperate to extricate themselves from this war, they simply cannot find a way out.
And finally, on today's edition of China Now, we continue with a conversation titled Why the Epstein Scandal Feels Alien in China. Here, Professor Fan Yopeng explores why the Epstein case sparked not only shock among many Chinese observers, but also a sense of cultural and political unfamiliarity. The discussion looks at how different political systems shape different forms of corruption and why elite influence through lobbying, finance, and informal social networks is often perceived very differently in China than in the United States. There's more.
After the Epstein case came out, this line went viral on the Chinese internet. Why? Because people suddenly felt that in China, in the age of Confucius more than 2,000 years ago, the moral standard we established is something today's Epstein circles still cannot reach.
I want to ask you a question because I think many of my American friends would also say, no, we also think this is morally extremely depraved, completely impossible to justify.
I believe many decent Americans would also think this is immoral. But look at how people pay attention to this issue, including the Epstein files. After people pay attention, how many of them are really, well, many are criticizing, mocking, and some are even spreading it as a kind of voyeuristic pleasure. How many people really raise the point that your political system should be held responsible for this?
You mean the political system should be responsible for this widespread moral depravity?
How many people really propose a thorough investigation and punishment of the people involved in this event? If this kind of thing happened in China, probably most ordinary people would direct their questioning straight at the foundation of the system. But in America, I see relatively little of that. Most people still direct their anger at a certain group, a certain party, or a certain class. They do not turn it into a questioning of the entire basic system.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Thinkers Forum. My name is Yunpeng. Today, I want to do something different. I want you to remember the first time you've heard Epstein's scandal, where you are, what you felt. This is a wild guess, but I'm thinking that you probably think if you believe that American elites are always like that, you feel vindicated. If you've never thought about it, you feel shocked that corruption can run that deep. The extent of that corruption is just unbelievable. But I want to say that if you ask that question to most of the Chinese people who are paying attention to the political sphere, and there are a lot of Chinese people who are paying attention to American politics, because American politics has been globalized, they would say that they are shocked because this is not a form of corruption that they are familiar with. I'm not saying that China doesn't have corruption. Of course it does. But I'm saying the specific form, that network effect that Epstein cultivated, the drug, the sex, all that stuff, is unfamiliar to the Chinese public. And today, I want to talk with Professor Fan Yongpeng precisely about why that is so unfamiliar to Chinese people and what that says about the different systems and how they shape corruption in China and America. Professor Fan is a professor of international relations at Fudan University. If you're not familiar with the Chinese universities, that is the kind of place that I can never get into. I'm going to say one more thing. This conversation will take place in Chinese because Professor Fan wants to use the language of his academic training to talk about this particular subject. But we are real people. We're not AI. It will be AI dubbed post facto in English. Hope you enjoyed this conversation. Hello, Professor Fan.
Hello, Yunpeng.
So let's begin with this question. What do you think someone like Epstein's success depended on? Why was he able to operate in the United States for decades, escape legal punishment again and again, and especially after escaping the American justice system, still maintain communication with so many people in elite social and political circles? Do you think this reflects an internal problem in the American system? or was it caused by Epstein's personal ability?
Right. I think one thing you mentioned in your opening is already the answer to this question. This is a form of corruption that Chinese people are very unfamiliar with. So why would this form of corruption appear? It must have something to do with America's cultural soil and institutional soil. Let me give one example. Chinese people and, say, Americans actually have different ideas of corruption. For Chinese people, what is the opposite of corruption? It is qinglian, clean and upright governance. I don't know whether English has a truly corresponding term. I feel it is quite hard, qinglian. But in English, what is the term often paired against corruption? Transparency, right? Transparency. Behind that is a difference between two sets of ideas. In China, many things can be viewed as corruption, as long as you are not upright as a person. As we say in Chinese, you are xiaoren, a petty person. If you use money to trade with power, if you use public power for your own private interest, or if you violate institutional rules, bend the law for personal relationships, all of that is corruption. But in the American context, corruption is defined as something like only when you violate a specific law or when you have some hidden dishonorable act, a conspiracy, then it is illegal, then it is corruption. So the two ways of seeing it are very, very different. From a Chinese perspective, what issue does corruption involve? It involves how public power is used. Public power can be corroded, corrupted, or exchanged in many ways. It is not only about power and money. For example, in my study of the history of human political institutions, there are several pairs of relationships that are very important indicators for understanding whether a system functions well and whether its corruption has become serious. One is civil-military relations, the relationship between politics and military force. Another is church-state relations, the relationship between politics and religion. A third is government-business relations, the relationship between politics, capital, and commerce. A fourth is the relationship with technology, politics, and technology. From these pairs of relationships, whether military force captures political power or religious power controls political power, in a certain sense, that is all a kind of corruption. But in the context of modern society, we usually understand corruption in a much narrower way, as a connection between political power and economic power, right? So if we put this in world history, it has very deep historical reason. Compared with most civilizations, Chinese civilization was very early, about more than 2,000 years ago, in relatively successfully resolving the relationship between politics and the military. For example, during the Spring and Autumn and Warring States periods, right? Many states needed to change their laws and reform.
The Spring and Autumn and Warring States period is roughly
500 years before 221 BC. During that process, China had many small states to compete with one another. These small states needed to stimulate a positive feedback loop of military power internally and build strong military states. So military power rose sharply in that process. But after the Qin unified China in 221 BC, you can see that from then until today, China has always kept military power firmly under political power. Of course, there were times in the middle when this failed. Once it failed, China would face major crises, but very soon that control would be restored. Especially after the Song dynasty, after the 10th century AD, China basically established firm civilian control over military power. So this is not a big problem for China. But if you look at the world today, in many places, military power remains an important political force. That includes the United States. Whether it is the military-industrial complex criticized by President Eisenhower or people like Peter Thiel today, and companies behind him like Palantir and Anduril directly taking part in military industry and military operations, they have in fact become a political force. Not to mention many third world countries that still have military governments today. The military remains an important political force. So from this perspective, China got away from this problem relatively early second. From the perspective of church-state relations, China is also one of the earliest, even perhaps the only large civilization to have escaped religious control over politics. We don't need to expand on that here. Everyone can clearly recognize that in the world today, political power that is completely free from control by religious forces probably exists mainly in the East Asian civilizational sphere centered on China.
If people want to hear this topic, we'll invite Professor Fan back another time to talk about religion and politics. I think when we talk about Palantir, many Americans, when hearing about Epstein, can instinctively feel that this form of corruption is not quite the same as the traditional corruption that comes out of the military-industrial complex President Eisenhower described. And when I talk about this with my lawyer friends or finance colleagues, sometimes they find it very awkward because in their daily work, people in finance, more or less, will come into contact with people who are not as extreme as Epstein, but are still what we call in Chinese political brokers. People who use their connections to benefit their clients. Some people would say this form of corruption is rooted in America's contemporary financial and political system. Do you agree with that?
I agree. I will talk about this a little later. Let me return to those two relationships: politics, military, and politics, religion. China has basically solved those two. But one problem China has still not completely solved today is the relationship between politics and commerce. In human history, political power is the greatest kind of public power. It can determine the life and death of a political community, and it is a core force in the distribution of resources. So all kinds of forces want to control and share in this power. The strongest among them is economic power. Through commerce or capital in its hands, through money, it can exchange with politics. In Chinese history, from around the Spring and Autumn and Warring States periods, commercial capital began to develop rapidly. After the Qin unified China, and especially from Emperor Wu of the Han Dynasty, China began to restrict commercial power. So for the next 2,000 years, this struggle continued. Overall, political power was able to steer economic power, but in quite a few cases, economic power could bite back against political power. The decline and collapse of many dynasties even were due to the excessive development of economic and financial forces.
So what does that excessive development usually look like?
For example, commercial capital successfully captures the bureaucracy, or financial power can cooperate with external threats, with foreign enemies. For financial capital, it has no motherland. What it cares about is only returns. So it's for who becomes emperor under heaven, right? For example, China's reform and opening up was very successful, and it stimulated the development of all kinds of private economy and all kinds of capital forces. But we always have to pay attention to a firewall. Economic forces must not be allowed to enter the boundary of political power. Why in ancient China there was a concept: scholars, farmers, artisans, and merchants. People in the Han Dynasty already explained very clearly why merchants are placed that way. It is not that merchants are discriminated against. It is that merchants or capital have the natural duty of seeking profit. What you pursue is private interest. China places special emphasis on the relationship between public and private, and on the public. So you should not also hold public power. If you hold public power, there is no way to prevent you from using public power to seek private profit, right? So Chinese people are very sensitive about this. You can see that since the 18th Party Congress.
The 18th Party Congress is the Communist Party of China's...
The 18th National Congress in 2012. Since then, China has particularly emphasized what is called a new type of government-business relationship, meaning the establishment of clear boundaries between public power, social power, and economic power. So the kind of Epstein case you mentioned, under the Chinese system, you cannot say it is completely impossible. There may be individual cases, but as a systematic and widespread phenomenon, it is impossible. Why? Because our system has very strict control over boundaries. But on the point your friend raised, the American system is very different from China's in this respect. For example, how did this Western system, including America and Europe, come into being? It arose from medieval Europe and developed into a new system, capitalist representative government, right? Before that, what was medieval Europe? It was a system of feudal private rights, feudalism. But once capitalism began to develop, people were quickly liberated from that feudal system, and a new bourgeois citizen class emerged, the bourgeoisie, and new proletarian workers also emerged, right? New peasants as well. In 1843, Marx wrote a series of articles and books analyzing this issue. He proposed several important concepts. One was political emancipation. What is political emancipation? It means your economic status no longer determines your political status or social status. He considered this a form of political emancipation. Another point was the emergence of civil society, a new social class different from the fixed classes of nobles and serfs in the past. A new social class began to appear called civil society, right? At the time, Marx was relatively optimistic. He believed capitalism had overthrown the feudal features of feudalism. So a basic feature of future capitalist society would be that Your economic status could not directly become your political status. But in reality, capitalism never fundamentally solved this problem. Marx was correct about that development, but the process was not completed. Why? Because the capitalist state adopted a system based on representative government. What is representative government? I have done some research in this area. For example, I have a book called From Company to State. Of course, it only touches a small part of this. I was studying questions such as what are the differences between the key points of the system we see now and feudalism? The difference is that economic status cannot directly turn into political status. But where is the similarity? Representative government competes for seats through votes and seats. And what is the fundamental determining factor in the end? Money. So it becomes a conversion in which economic status can indirectly turn into political power.
In your view, today's American representative democracy,
Today's America, including the West, and including most countries around the world that adopt so-called liberal democracy, that is, mass elections plus a multi-party system, are not, in essence, decided by one person, one vote. They're decided by $1, one vote. So this kind of system has a natural feature. Its political power is open. It is a pluralist or polyarchic political system. For example, its legislature is open to lobbying. Its political power is open to being corrupted by economic power. It has revolving doors and all kinds of mechanisms. From the positive side, it can reflect the interests of different parts of society, especially some new interests and new voices, which can play a role inside it. Its weakness is that ordinary people cannot generate a loud enough voice to influence this decision-making mechanism. This legislative body, only large interest groups, corporate interest groups, or major special interest groups can influence such a system. So the appearance of someone like Epstein serves precisely such a system. Epstein is not an abnormal phenomenon in American politics. He is a normal phenomenon. It is just that he committed too many illegal acts, so he became a very typical case. But before him, less serious Epstein-like figures were everywhere. Go to Washington, D.C., look at the organizations on K Street. All those think tanks, and also in Europe, the think tanks that lobby you institutions in Brussels. A large amount of what they do is similar. They broker among commercial capital, various issue groups and interest groups, and political power. So when you compare it with the Chinese system, you discover that the biggest feature of our system is a strict firewall between public power and any private power. In America, there's a very smooth channel.
I want to ask you, to what extent is this a uniquely American problem? And to what extent is it a general problem when representative democracy and capitalism coexist? Because when we look at the Epstein list and see important politicians and public figures, from Bill Gates to Peter Mandelson to Bill Clinton, most of them are figures from the Anglo-American capitalist world. But Australia and even Japan could also call themselves standard representative democracies. And yet people from those places rarely appear on Epstein's list. Not because he did not try to approach them, but because, for various reasons, they did not enter Epstein's inner circle. How do you see this?
First, it is certainly a general problem of modern capitalism and also a general problem of this representative democratic system. But the specific Epstein case also reflects America's uniqueness. The United States itself is different from most Western countries. For example, the United States has separation of powers, right? Checks and balances. Separation of powers. In the past, many Chinese scholars would say this is a universal value, right? In fact, it is not universal. It is not a universal system. In many countries, for example, among the 20-plus major Western countries, maybe only a few adopt strong or weak separation of powers. Most do not, including...
The United Kingdom is also based on parliamentary sovereignty, not separation of powers.
But Britain later also moved somewhat in this direction, right? France too. The more orthodox cases would be Canada, including Germany, right? For example, the late American political scientist Robert Dahl wrote a book, How Democratic is the American Constitution? In that book, he compared 22 advanced, so-called democratic countries with the United States. He argued that things like a strong presidential system, separation of powers, federalism, and so on are all minority exceptions among Western countries. What is special about America first? America is especially large, so it formed a federal system. Federal power and state power are divided. So there are many cracks in between, many places where people can lobby and operate.
What do you mean by cracks in power?
Because the central government cannot directly govern everything. Unlike some small or medium-sized European countries, which are centralized and can directly manage all parts of the country. So the entire country is covered under one power system. In America, the states have their own independent sources of power, strictly speaking according to the US Constitution, or according to the logic at the time of the founding. The federal government cannot represent the people at the Constitutional Convention. The first words of the US Constitution were "we the people," right? At the time there was controversy. Representatives of the states said, you, the federal government, have no right to say "we the people."
Or at least on which issues can the states or the federal government better represent the people?
It is not only about issues. The states were saying, we are the source of power. We are the only people. Then through the Constitution, we enumerate certain powers and give them to the federal government. All powers outside the enumerated powers, the residual powers, belong to us. So during the Civil War, a famous Southern politician, John C. Calhoun, proposed a nullification, meaning I can refuse to accept federal law.
But contemporary American constitutional scholars would say this issue was already resolved after the Civil War through 3 consecutive constitutional amendments.
But in practice, it was not fundamentally resolved. For example, in the past year or two, some American states opposed President Trump's border measures, right? At one point, it almost came to armed conflict, including California and Texas resisting certain federal policies. This has not been fundamentally solved. So America's sovereignty structure is double-layered. This double sovereignty structure creates a lot of space in the middle for political operations. Second, because America's separation of powers, gaps also form among different branches. So in some countries like Germany, with a scale of tens of millions of people, things may be better, or in smaller countries where centralization is stronger, it may be better. Also, European countries do have their own historical accumulation, including some civilizational and moral traditions. In some respects, they may not produce a phenomenon as exaggerated as Epstein. Also, some non-Western countries that later became Western countries, like South Korea and Japan, have both an East Asian civilizational foundation and borrowed liberal democratic institutions. So they adopted different forms. For example, they operate political activity behind the scenes through something like feudal power or chaebol power. So in Japan and South Korea, you don't see very active government business transactions on the surface. But in reality, many major transactions happen in deep political games. The image you see may therefore be different from America.
So you think it is this political vacuum created by checks and balances that gives political brokers like Epstein the potential to use their resources, to engage in lobbying work that is not only allowed in politics, but needed by politics?
Yes, that is right.
What do you think are some? Because I can imagine an American listener hearing this and thinking it makes sense logically. But when we look at what Epstein actually did, it often does not look as grand as what you are describing. Much of it was very typical low-level corruption. For example, Peter Mandelson, the British politician, did many things that look like taking small bits of inside information from Epstein and passing them to British investors, or passing British intelligence information through Epstein to American investors. That seems like a very low-level form of corruption, and does not require invoking a grand narrative about checks and balances, creating a power vacuum.
As an individual case, that is indeed true, but Epstein is not a simple individual case. He involves all kinds of factors. For example, President Biden can pardon his own son, right? President Trump can use his son-in-law Kushner to handle international affairs. Speaker Pelosi can use her legislative work to trade stocks, for example. President Trump can use his presidential power to sell his own cryptocurrency, right? Not to mention that in federal and state legislatures, in recent years, there has even been a phenomenon of letting relatives, daughters, wives, family members, succeed them and take over their position. This is a typical feudal behavior. So the fact that it can explode like this shows that the system itself already has very serious problems. Why does this phenomenon appear today? American politics itself has undergone a process of decay. I remember around 2013 or 2014, the American scholar Francis Fukuyama wrote a book on political origins and political decay, right? Actually, Huntington had raised this topic even earlier. Raising it at that time was very timely because American politics was undergoing decay. So some behaviors that people previously might have considered indecent in the past 10 or 20 years have begun to become accepted behavior. So someone like Epstein could become even more at home, able to move with ease. But in any case, we have to see that his problem is systemic corruption, not an individual problem. Earlier, I mentioned that in the American concept, the word paired with corruption is transparency. Many Western countries have this kind of culture. It creates a problem. Corruption is not treated as a moral judgment, but as a legal judgment. And a legal judgment can solve the problem very simply through legislation. I can legalize it. If a conspiracy is a hidden illegal thing, then if I legalize it, isn't the problem solved? Let me give a typical example: American political donations. Businessmen can use money to buy votes. Is this behavior corruption? In the Chinese political context, I think it is certainly corruption. But in America, during the progressive period in the 1970s, it was also once regarded as corruption. I remember the 1974 amendments to the Federal Election Campaign Act set some rules. Your donations could not exceed certain limits, and later political action committees began to appear.
And that continued until about 20 years ago. This law was still widely used until Citizens United overturned the core provisions of the law.
Starting in 1976, there were lawsuits trying to overturn this, all the way into the 2010s, right? I remember, yes, in the 2010s, it was overturned by the Supreme Court. The reason was that it violated freedom of speech, the freedom of money to speak.
It violated the free speech rights of American corporations.
Right, so legally speaking, it is no longer corruption, but from the perspective of human civilization and institutions, it is corruption. This American culture of corruption, this system will inevitably lead to institutional corruption. It is not about whether an individual has committed a crime or whether someone like Epstein has high or low moral standards. It is a systemic behavior.
I want to talk about why Chinese people find this form of Epstein-style corruption so shocking. It is not only shocking in degree, but shocking in form. You just explained it from the perspective of Chinese traditional culture. But I want to talk with you about how China institutionally ensures that this kind of phenomenon is very hard to appear. We are not saying it is impossible in China, but it is very hard for it to appear in contemporary China. From the perspective of institutional design, what has China done?
First, many details in the Epstein case really crossed the moral bottom line for Chinese people. It is not that a particular criminal act does not exist in China. It is that such conduct in China would be considered an extremely serious crime and an immoral act. One reason comes from, for example, the minors, 30 or so underage girls, and one prosecutor could give him, how to say it, an exemption or something, and not prosecute him, right? Give him
a sentence that other people considered extremely light.
Right? For example, in prison or in the detention center, he somehow committed suicide, right? This kind of behavior in Chinese history was morally denied very early on. One very important figure in this was Confucius, because in Chinese history, we also went through dark periods, wars, and periods of general moral decline. But Confucius established something very important for Chinese people, a moral standard. So there is an old saying, if heaven had not produced Zhangni, the ages would have remained like a long night.
I was actually very curious how AI would translate this line.
After the Epstein case came out, this line went viral on the Chinese internet. Why? Because people suddenly felt that in China, in the age of Confucius more than 2,000 years ago, the moral standard we established is something today's Epstein circles still cannot reach.
I want to ask you a question, because I think many of my American friends would also say, no, we also think this is morally extremely depraved, completely impossible to justify.
I believe many decent Americans would also think this is immoral. But look at how people pay attention to this issue, including the Epstein files. After people pay attention, how many of them are really, well, many are criticizing, mocking, and some are even spreading it as a kind of voyeuristic pleasure. How many people really raise the point that your political system should be held responsible for this?
You mean the political system should be responsible for this widespread moral depravity?
How many people really propose a thorough investigation and punishment of the people involved in this event? If this kind of thing happened in China, probably most ordinary people would direct their questioning straight at the foundation of the system. But in America, I see relatively little of that. Most people still direct their anger at a certain group, a certain party, or a certain class. They do not turn it into a questioning of the entire basic system.
I want to ask you about that. You said that when China sees this kind of, not this kind, but large-scale corruption, Chinese citizens and Chinese officials generally point the root of the problem toward institutional design and fundamental logic. Can you give us a few examples? When large-scale corruption appears in China, what are the government's usual methods of responding? Because in this case, one thing many people find incomprehensible is that Epstein's corruption involved so many people and lasted so long. But in the end, only he and Maxwell really went to prison for it. Many people cannot accept that.
In China, we first have to begin with the concept political responsibility. Political responsibility is a very important concept. In human history, any ruling group, while enjoying the right to rule, must first fulfill the responsibility of ruling. This is the most basic balance between rights and obligation. So if you look at ancient China, around 1046 BC, roughly 3,000 years ago, when the Zhou dynasty was founded, the Zhou people proposed an entire set of ideas about political responsibility. For example, in one of China's oldest documents, the Book of Documents, there are many discussions. A ruler must be cautious and fearful, right? Like driving a chariot pulled by 6 horses with rotten reins, like walking on ice that is about to melt, as if standing before a deep abyss. And there is the idea, if all under heaven are guilty, the responsibility lies with one person. That means, for all the problems under heaven, I bear ultimate responsibility. This was the period when the Chinese concept of political responsibility emerged. From then on, throughout Chinese dynastic history, our basic requirement for a good dynasty, good politics, and a good emperor was that you must take responsibility, right? And in Western history, and in the histories of other civilizations, we can see more or less the same thing. For example, in the era of primitive tribes, if I am the tribal chief, I must bear ultimate responsibility. In the aristocratic era, if I am a noble, when foreign enemies come, I must ride my horse, drive my chariot, and fight. I do not work the land, but I must bleed and sacrifice for the country. That is the honor and mission of the nobility. So what lies behind this? A concept of responsibility. But the modern bourgeoisie is the first ruling group in human history that only enjoys the right to rule, without assuming political responsibility and obligation. Through representative government, separation of powers, federalism, and other systems, it divides power into a very plural and fragmented form. Through mutual vetoes among different branches of power, it forms a very complicated power machine. As Fukuyama put it, it becomes a vetocracy, a veto mechanism. Meanwhile, through mass elections, it creates the illusion of democracy. So-called democracy means everyone has voted. Since you voted, how this country turns out is your responsibility. This official was elected by you. This party was voted into power by you. It is your responsibility. So you have to bear responsibility.
Completely ignoring that this is the result of a two-party representative system.
The group that actually occupies the ruling position behind a capitalist country bears no political responsibility. For example, in China, if I encounter a crisis or a problem, I will definitely go to the government. You must take responsibility. If you do not take responsibility, I will protest, I will petition. But in America, if someone is treated unjustly, who does he go to? Who is the government?
He gets a lawyer and sues the federal government.
Or the state government, or the city government, or the county government. Does he go to the executive branch, the legislative branch, or the Supreme Court, right? So in front of him, it is like Kafka's novel, The Castle, like a castle whose door you can never find. You do not know where it is. It is invisible. This kind of system successfully exempts itself from political responsibility. But China's system, the Communist Party system, is a system of unlimited responsibility. In my book, I define America as what kind of state? A limited liability state. It is limited. China is unlimited, a state of unlimited responsibility. Why do I say America is limited? Because if you look at the design of its whole system, it is like a company. It only bears limited responsibility. So after COVID in America, including during COVID when so many people died, and after COVID when America saw declining life expectancy, it does not have to take responsibility. During the entire pandemic, no American official was punished. No matter how large the tragedy, and later, no matter how many major public infrastructure accidents or public disasters occurred, no one bore responsibility.
American politicians might say that the responsibility they bear is that they can be voted out of office through elections. But you mean that this is not truly taking responsibility because they do not personally pay a real consequence for it?
Right. That is really only the responsibility of a manager. It is not real political responsibility. In China, every year we can see in the news that if there is a traffic accident, a mining disaster, a problem with food at an elementary school or kindergarten, a public opinion incident, or a violent conflict on the street, officials may be disciplined, removed from office, or even imprisoned. Our system, the Chinese Communist Party system, assumes unlimited responsibility toward the people and the country. This creates a situation when facing corruption, government business transactions, and the capture of political power by various forces, it acts as the final regulator, the final responsible party. The Chinese Communist Party sits in the final chair of Chinese politics. All problems in the political system are ultimately mine to bear. So it has an incentive. I must watch all problems and solve them, right? So for some behaviors you just mentioned that break through the moral bottom line of humanity, if they happened in China, of course they can happen, but they are individual cases. Once they are exposed, once they go online or are reported, something like Epstein sexually assaulting more than 30 underage girls could not simply be handed to one prosecutor in China. An investigation team, possibly even one sent by the central government, would definitely come down. The locality might conduct investigation and trial in another jurisdiction, and multiple departments would jointly.
We will soon talk about how the Chinese government handles similar things in practice. But I want to first ask about your point on morality and political responsibility.
And that was definitely very insightful. I hope you enjoyed Professor Fang's perspectives as much as I did on this topic. But that's how we wrap up today's edition of China Now. From the future of US-China relations to the deeper political and cultural questions shaping today's world, we've explored a wide range of perspectives on this week's edition of China Now. I am Makiza Latifa. As always, I want to say thank you for joining us, and we'll see you same time next week.